Hello and welcome to the Smart Food Supply Chain webinar series. I'm Mike Ellen and I serve AIM as their Member Engagement Manager. AIM North America is an alliance enabling the cooperation, development, standardization of AIDC technologies. From barcodes to RFID to IoT, AIM North America is your advocate. Any organization with an interest in data collection is a beneficiary of these efforts. Membership provides an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, develop policies and standards, access market reports, and engage new partners. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over. On this slide, you see our antitrust policy. It's the policy of AIM Inc. to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activity shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. Our collaboration and work product policy states that committee meetings and presentations are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM's developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Just a few more housekeeping items. You will notice that you are muted. You will be muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, you can send those to me through the chat dialog option located on the bottom of the right of your screen. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar. Today, I am here with Jeanne Duckett of Avery Dennison. Jeanne works on Transparency Initiative Development and also serves on AIM North America's Board of Directors, AIM North America's Food Policy, and is AIM's Track and Trace Chairman. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you, Mike. So, as Michael said, my name is Jeanne Duckett, and I'm with the Avery Dennison Corporation. My role with Avery Dennison in the Printer Systems Division is focused on transparency and how to enable transparency in the supply chain, especially in food, but I'm also involved in some other transparency initiatives. So today we're going to discuss the FDA New Era of Food Safety. I had the privilege last October of providing public comment for both AIM and Avery Dennison at the FDA public hearings in DC. In December, AIM North America and AIM Global provided written comments back to the FDA about this initiative as well. So today, we're just going to go over some background of the last 100 years of federal food safety regulations and compliance in the United States. We're going to go through a brief overview of the era of smarter food safety. This webinar is actually really meant to be a kickoff webinar for AIM North America, which are going to discuss and go into more detail in the concepts surrounding the new era of smarter food safety in more detail. And then finally, as Michael said, we'll have some time for some wrap-ups and some questions. Next slide. So I just briefly want to go through the history of food safety, really about just the last 100 years in the United States. I've actually gotten interested in the history of food safety, and it's a very fascinating topic, and it actually goes back to when we were using salt as payment with these concepts of adulterated foods. But in the United States in 1938, the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act was passed. And the goal of this act was to prohibit the movement in interstate commerce of adulterated and misbranded foods, drugs, devices, and cosmetics. The law contained both civil and criminal clauses, but most violations under this law are civil, though repeated and fraudulent violations have been treated as criminal law. All violations of the FD&C Act require interstate commerce because of the commerce clause contained within the Act, but this is often interpreted very broadly. Though the FD&C Act has been substantially altered since its passing in 1938, the Act still remains in its basic structure. The heart of the enforcement procedures of the FD&C, which founded the FDA, is Section 301, which enumerates specific prohibited acts. This act prohibits have been described as a catalog of definitions elaborating two basic concepts that continue today: the concept of adulteration and misbranding. Section 301 generally makes it illegal to distribute directly or indirectly a covered product in interstate commerce, whether that's adulterated or misbranded. The FD&C Act labels adulterated or misbranded to be products whose composition, production, or labeling fails to meet the substantive requirements of the Act. Anyway, so I wondered, what is adulterated food? Because from my background in engineering, I didn't have a really good concept. So adulterated food is food that's considered generally impure, unsafe, and unwholesome. And as we'll talk about a little later in this presentation, we're now getting into the concept of intentional adulteration and unintentional adulteration. So any food that has been improperly stored or handled or commingled would fall under the adulterated food clause. Misbranded products are products labeled that do not disclose the product's contents or misleads the interpretation of its contents. The FD&C Act uses the concept of strict liability, which is one of the very few federal statutes that do. Strict liability differs from ordinary negligence because strict liability establishes liability without fault. So a person can be held liable just because an injury happened. The fact that the harm the plaintiff suffered is not the defendant's fault doesn't make a difference. So for instance, if I walk into a retail grocery establishment and purchase romaine lettuce and I fall ill from consuming that romaine lettuce, I can hold that retail grocery liable even though they did not obviously grow or produce or process that lettuce. And then, you start wondering about how do these regulations apply to traceability, which is one of our topics today. So around 2002, the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Act was passed. And this is a key act in the terms of traceability because this act placed obligations on those who manufacture, process, pack, transport, distribute, receive, hold, or import food. As you can see from this list, the regulation is intended to be applied very broadly to pretty much anybody who touches this food throughout the whole chain of distribution. Information must be tracked, includes dates of production, description of food, quantity, manner of packaging, and lot numbers. In addition, those shipping must have contact information for the people receiving the food. This has become known as the one-up, one-down traceability law. And it was definitely a start in getting us through this whole chain traceability, which we're now talking about these days. But basically, what you had to know is you had to know where you received a product from and where it was sent to meet the requirement. There was no requirements on how to store the data, however. So one of the challenges of this, and I actually attended a workshop put on by United Fresh and Recall Readiness, is the FDA literally was receiving truckloads of paper records. And they had to shift through those paper records to try to establish the chain of custody of the product. So in 2008, after the Spanish recalls of 2005, the Produce Traceability Initiative, sponsored by the Produce Marketing Associations from both Canada and U.S., GS1 U.S. and GS1 Canada, and United Fresh, were designed to help produce achieve effective tracking of a standardized process to enhance the speed and efficiency of traceability systems. So the PTI started with the bold vision that was going to achieve chain-wide adoption of electronic traceability. The early focus back in 2008 was on case labeling, and the PTI initiative certainly set many milestone standards in whole chain traceability. So you fast forward to 2011, and in the United States, about 4,800 million people, 1 in 6 Americans, get sick annually with food poisoning. 128,000 are hospitalized and 3,000 die. So that's a significant considered a significant public health burden that was considered preventable, or at least they could reduce the numbers. And so this law and these things and the many incidents of foodborne illnesses during the 2000 led to 2011 President Obama signing into law the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, which basically was mainly sponsored by the Grocery Manufacturing Association. And at that time in 2011, they estimated that tainted food had cost the food industry billions of dollars during the 2000s. This bill was similar to an earlier bill that was passed in 2009 and was considered the first major overhaul of food regulation in this country since 1938. And the 7 key parts were the Preventable Controls Rule, Produce Safety Rule, Foreign Supplier Verification, Accredited Third Party, Sanitary Transport, Internet Intentional Adulteration, and how do you document and comply with the FSMA. So almost a year ago, so you had all these things happening. So almost a year ago, Frank Yenes had been in the FDA for a few months at that point in time. Him and Ned Sharpless came out with an announcement that they were going to go to a new era of smarter food safety. And they were going to be looking and soliciting input from a broad cross-section of people to whose the purpose is to protect and strengthen and protect the food supply chain. So in October of this year, they held a meeting, and the purpose of the meeting was to form a dialogue with domestic and international regulatory people, public health, industry, consumers, academia, solution partners, and other. And with the input received from this meeting and the comments submitted to the docket, the FDA is planning on releasing in Q1 this year basically a blueprint for the new era of smarter food safety. And they're going to use this to be able to trace sources of contaminated food, suggest and encourage the use of predictive analytics like artificial intelligence, and help prioritize the agency's resources. So Frank Yenes opened this event with a check and basically said he's describing we're currently in a food revolution. According to him, in the next 10 years, we're posed to have more change in the food industry than we did in the last 40. And there's 4 things that he called out that are, leading to this. And that's basically the increased leadership scrutiny of these repeated food violations and food recalls, the competitive cost pressure from ethical branding, speed to market, and accessibility and maturity of technologies such as AIDC, blockchain, wireless technologies, and technologies that can help facilitate these initiatives. While innovations in supply chain technologies enable food transparency, the recent Food Safety Modernization Act helped provide a traceability roadmap. The movement is going to be driven by people. So the new era of smarter food safety is branded as being technology-enabled, people-led, FSMA-backed. And the FDA implemented 4 groups targeting 4 beacons for the smarter food safety: technology-enabled traceability and outbreak response, smarter tools and approaches for prevention, new business models and retail modernization, and the food safety culture. So the first one, tech-enabled traceability, Frank Yenes was quoted that basically in his view, today's food system is really safe. He feels, and he has said this, and I've heard him say it on multiple occasions, that the American food system is very safe and it functions very well. But it does have one major Achilles heel, and that's the lack of traceability and transparency. You don't have to look, too far to see what this lack of traceability cost is. Cost of a recall today for the average company is $10 million. The total recalls in the United States increased by 10% between 2013 and 2018, with a peak in 2016. And Class 1 recalls during that time period, those recalls based upon a reasonable probability that contaminated food is going to cause a health problem, increased by 83%. So the FDA plans to overcome the challenges in these systems, but with the new era of food safety that's going to leverage technologies such as blockchain, artificial intelligence, IoT devices. And this is really going to enable a safer, from a regulatory standpoint, but a lot of times people ask, what is the business impact of this? So recently there was published the results of a year-long traceability pilot with a major global retailer that showed that the food traceability gains. It drove profits up. They reported increased profits of 55%. Howling Group, which is a worldwide greenhouse grower and marketer participating in the program, publicly commented that increased traceability was mandated by the buyer and was not met with a degree of hesitancy. They're concerned about the hardware costs, the increased workload. They initially considered it a box ticking thing. We have to do this because the person we sell to is telling us we have to do it. But what they found is traceability has become more than a compliance need. It's actually becoming a differentiator for their business that's growing their business. And today there's successful pilots that have been operating all over the world. AIM North America, led by member group Food Logic, has a session coming up on tech-enabled traceability on February 26th. So enhancing smarter tools and approaches for prevention, enhancing the use of new knowledge from traceback data streams for enabling rapid data analytics. And this ability to use these new data analysis tools is something the FDA is looking at leveraging in this blueprint. And they're really going after trust and transparency and data sharing. There's 2 recent pilots that helped. One was done with Yelp and Twitter. So basically, foodborne illnesses are overwhelmingly unreported and underdiagnosed in the general population. And that's true because the symptoms primarily look like flu symptoms. So with the popularity of social media, they got this tool to catch foodborne illnesses and outbreaks. So a pilot was actually ran where they used data analytics to analyze reporting on social media to identify where potential outbreaks were occurring. So that was one thing. There was another pilot ran with geographical information systems technology. So it refers to the combination of geographical data with data attributes such as climate conditions and other characteristics of the location. So for produce production in a particular area, it's been implemented to predict potential contamination. And they're using satellite data and remote sensing techniques to give an idea that, hey, you may have to go do more testing in this area. The FDA announced last May that they're going to continue to run wide-scale pilots using artificial intelligence to aid in food regulation. So another one of the tenets of the AIR New Smarter Food Safety is this idea of new business models and retail modernization. And this is really talking about advancing food safety for e-commerce and home-delivered foods, as well as traditional food establishments. But they're also brought in this concept of crowdsourced delivery. So they talk about the need for more collaboration and establishing a common standard to level the playing field, and also how to address the issues of last mile and provide food safety training for crowdsourced food delivery personnel, and as well as harmonizing these standards. One of the things that came up last October in the meetings is there's significant regulations around cold chain today, production of dairy and meat products as they transport the cold chain. But these last mile delivery solutions are emerging so quickly, there's not as much focus on how to control the food safety factors in those areas. Food safety. So promoting and recognizing the role of food safety culture on farms and facilities, and to be able to influence employees and companies and what they think about food safety and how they demonstrate this. So the FDA is working with the CDC and the USDA states to help develop this culture of food safety. So you might ask, what are the characteristics of an effective food safety culture and why is it important? If you think about it, there's always been instances of safety issues and, oil spills. When you look at most major accidents that occur, it's usually because someone didn't think they could occur, or they didn't report it, or they noticed something and didn't take action on it. So the whole basis of the culture of food safety, which Frank Yenis explains in his book on the subject, is you go through and you identify what defines a culture of food safety. So basically, you do a really good job of stating what expectations are and how to meet them. So you have a clear idea of expectations. You have continuous training programs. You talk and communicate about how you're achieving your food safety goals. So you set metrics and then you communicate how you're achieving them. And then also you establish a strong culture from the top leadership team. And the leadership team comes out speaking in favor of that culture of food safety. One of the things another one of our seminars is going to be on hazard analysis and critical control points has that, which actually came out from NASA out of the 1960s, is a documented way of kind of testing and learning about this culture of food safety. So why is the culture of food safety so important? So I have on the screen here basically something from stopfoodborneillnesses.org, victims of foodborne illness. I don't know if you've seen this last Sunday night on NBC. Frank Innes was interviewed by NBC to follow up on a story by the Boston Globe. The title of the story was Danger in Our Salad Bowl. The interview basically went through a young 3-year-old boy, Lucas Parker, who in California, he's a Canadian national. In California, he consumed some of the tainted romaine lettuce. And they talked about over the 15 months since the incident, all the impacts to this little boy. And so the NBC News reported, however, little Lucas Parker contracted the disease over 45 days before the CDC or the FDA came out with the recall. And in that particular instance, there was never an exact source of contamination located. When he got sick on October 18, 2018, he was more than one of 60 reported cases of E. coli. I went through these topics pretty quickly, and want to encourage you guys to ask questions, get involved, and then watch out for the webinar announcements for the New Era Food Safety series from AIM.
All right, thank you, Jeannie, for the input and information you gave us today. There's still time to ask some questions. I do have a few that I can go ahead and start off with and ask you right now.
Okay.
How does this affect Amazon and other retailers who now do online food sales?
So today, the federal regulations do not extend to delivery of online, either by the retailer themselves or by crowdsourced deliveries such as Uber Eats or Grubhub or Ship It. But in the coming months, Frank Innes has stated that he's going to come out with a blueprint for this new era of food safety, and I would expect to see in the upcoming announcements some guidance on how to handle home delivery.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have is, how does CORE fit into this?
I am not familiar with CORE.
I guess that's Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation.
Oh, so CORE is a new initiative by the FDA, and they are one of the people that have been running a pilot using artificial intelligence, trying to identify food outbreak sources before the CDC comes and says that they have a food outbreak. I would expect to see a greater cooperation between states and the federal government in this outline, because the federal government has earmarked funding for states to do enhancement of outbreak response.
Thanks. Another question we received is, what are the specific ways that are being used in track and trace applications?
So there is a global traceability spec that identifies how to identify products, what are the attributes that you need to have on the data carrier, what events you need to capture. These events include things like commissioning, packing, shipping, receiving, transformation, consumption, disposal, as well as monitoring events for cold chain and CO2 and other sensor type information. But as far as specific technologies, they range all over the board. There was recently a pilot in Spain using NFC to track oranges to the supply chain. Barcodes, 2D barcodes are used significantly. Intelligent labels are used. So there's a variety of technologies to meet what you're trying to do. What the government efforts are going to be centered on is harmonizing what data is on the item and what data is captured, and at what point does the data have to be captured.
And another question along those lines, are digital watermarks currently being tested for track and trace?
Yes, digital watermarks is a valid technology used in traceability. Digital watermarks have the ability to contain more than just the G10 or the UPC code. So any data carrier that can contain more information than just a UPC code down to like a lot level, or in the case of digital watermarks, down to an individual level, can be used for traceability purposes.
Okay, great. And you touched about it a little bit during the presentation, but are there other ways that the FDA is discussing in terms of communicating product recalls, other than just it being in the news, or through an app?
So, so one of the resources on the resource slide that everybody will get lists where the government currently lists all the recalls for both the USDA and the FDA, and that's their current method, is sending you an email. Basically, from a consumer standpoint, you can go in and opt in to the emails, get informed of every recall that occurs. But as well as that, some retailers have been working with loyalty cards to be able to inform you that the product that you purchased has been recalled. The GS1 is currently looking at expanded data carriers on pack, which are going to enable retailers, whether you're an e-commerce retailer or a brick and mortar grocery store, to be able to clearly identify items that were sold to people. So yeah, I think you're going to see a much more proactive, direct method of communication than the one that exists today, which is basically opt into an email list.
Okay, well, Jeanne, thank you for your time and knowledge today.
Thank you, Mike.
I would also like to thank our audience for their active participation. And before we go, just a reminder that we will be back on February 12th with another webinar for the Food Supply Chain webinar series. Thank you and have a great day.